Hello, friends. The most difficult situation is not when evil occurs and we lack the resources to fight it. The most difficult situation is when evil occurs and we lack the ethics to fight it. In February, March 2022, we lacked resources. However, despite the lack of resources, we stood firm against evil. We stood firm against Russia. And in February, March 2025, in the fourth year of the war, we lacked the ethics to fight evil. We lacked the ethics to fight Russia. Therefore, we might not withstand. As soon as there is a lack of ethics, the mind immediately activates, reason immediately activates, and the mind begins to seek good where it does not exist. The mind begins to seek prospects where evil resides. Representatives of the higher political authority of Ukraine in Saudi Arabia act with evil. And they want to present this evil as good in the form of so-called honorable peace or dignified peace. The concept of just peace has changed for us to the concept of dignified peace. Although we all feel and understand that there will be no peace and no dignity. We will not be able to exit this situation with dignity. But the greatest horror of all the days we are experiencing is our relationships with our former partners, the Americans, with our colleagues from the USA, and what is happening simultaneously. In Moscow, Steve Witkoff, which some kind of envoy from Donald Trump for relations with Moscow, although Keith Kellogg was the official representative on issues of Russia and Ukraine, but the United States of America, Donald Trump's administration, for some reason, decided to replace Keith Kellogg with someone more convenient. His name is Steve Witkoff. Yes, this is the biggest horror that tests us on ethics. And instead of exiting this negotiation process, this disgrace, we continue some negotiations in Saudi Arabia. The situation strongly reminds me of what happened in Istanbul on March 29th, when 2 hours before the so-called negotiations, the Russian Federation launched a missile strike on the Mykolaiv Regional State Administration, destroying an entire section of the Rasay. I would like to remind you that, according to unofficial data, which is accurate, unofficially 102 people died. I don't know how many were injured, although officially it was reported that 39 or 40 people died. So our delegation, instead of making a démarche, packing their things and flying out of Istanbul, continued the conversation with the Russian Federation, knowing about this war crime against humanity. And now, some new Biabar representative, Steve Witkoff, is making public statements that are no different from what happened on March 29th, 2022 in Mykolaiv. He is making statements that are completely incompatible with ethics. And they are not compatible with international law at all, nor with justice, nor with anything. Of course, he does all this on Tucker Carlson's podcast. I would like to analyze some points in detail of this podcast to such an extent. What Steve Witkoff himself said, you can read the transcript, you can watch the video in the Russian translation, you can watch it in the original. We are experiencing some unprecedented things that, and are not noticed or analyzed by us. The first thing I want to draw attention to is the very pair of interlocutors, Steve Witkoff, and he was so surprised. As an official of such a level, can afford to go for an interview with Tucker Carlson. Well, we have an equivalent, Dmytro Gordon, but Dmytro Gordon stands much higher in this hierarchy. In terms of his intellect and erudition, he is an unscrupulous person. I, for example, cannot recall anyone today from the higher officials, despite all the issues in our political sphere, allowing themselves to give an interview to Dmytro Gordon, would go to his show. Steve Witkoff, essentially the main key figure. Now, in this situation, who just spoke with Putin is going to America and giving an interview to Tucker Carlson. And somehow this doesn't add up for me. The next point, what is everything based on? On the belief or conviction that politicians, in their public statements, they don't speak fully. And they conceal. And what they conceal is the truth. A harsh, bitter truth that our deceitful world is not ready to accept. This is the belief in the Trump administration. I emphasize again, politicians are withholding the truth, which the deceitful world is not ready to accept. And therefore, the mission of the USA is to seek out this truth around the world and send their esteemed representatives to talk with such people who possess this truth, but are afraid to express it because it is dangerous for them. Otherwise, they will be hounded in the world, hounded by the deceitful world. And this truth, of course, resides in Moscow, in the Kremlin. And the bearer of this truth, Vladimir Putin. And Donald Trump sends Steve Witkoff to... Witkoff met with Putin in a private, informal setting. To him, Steve Witkoff was informed of this truth. And he, Steve Witkoff, on Tucker Carlson's podcast with that simpleton, will inform everyone about what is kept silent. Putin, about which truth Putin remains silent. And it turned out, the truth is that Ukraine somehow possesses Russian lands. And these lands are protected by the Ukrainian constitution. Russians live here, who are being oppressed and killed by Ukrainians, or I don't know how to put it. And Putin has one task: to liberate these Russians. This is important to understand. Zaporizhia region, Kherson region, Donbas, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, of course. This is the terrible truth that Putin was hiding. And of course, another truth that Witkoff brought from Moscow is that Putin is not planning to attack anyone. He is not even planning to attack Kiev. And he is not planning to attack Europe. He doesn't need anything. He is just very concerned about the Russians living here in these 4 regions and in Crimea. The only question that arises is, what were the Russian troops doing in February, March, near Kiev in 2022? What were they doing in Irpin and Bucha? Why were they killing people there, Ukrainians? Were they holding ethnic Russians hostage in Bucha and Irpin? Or what is the question? And why is the Russian army stationed at the borders of Belarus? And why is there a constant threat of invasion? Is it happening in Volyn? Steve Witkoff is silent on this issue. That is, he comes to America and starts telling the truth from Vladimir Putin. That Putin is not planning to attack anyone. That's it. He, literally, still needs to return. Kherson and Zaporizhia. Take note, it has completely changed. The concept and the setup. If earlier we were convinced, as soon as Trump came to power, we were convinced that we didn't need it to legally recognize the occupied territories as Russian, and then somehow it will be resolved. Now it turns out we need to recognize. And why should Ukraine recognize these territories as Russian if the international community can do it? Gather the United Nations and recognize these territories as Russian. Why should Ukraine recognize this? I cannot understand. Why are there claims against Ukraine? Why are they working with Zelensky and the Ukrainians? That we must recognize all of this. If there are much more serious countries for this, China, India, the United States, America, gather together and recognize that these are Russian territories. Confirm this truth that Vladimir Putin has stated. But that's not all. Despite the fact that, pay attention, The main thing here is not to get confused. Steve Witkoff went to Putin so that he could whisper to him what he cannot say publicly, that great truth and justice. But despite the fact that Putin supposedly told him everything he had to say in a non-public, informal setting, Steve Witkoff, on a podcast with this Tucker Carlson, he says that he feels that Putin will not attack Europe. So it turns out that despite the mission to get the whole truth, Putin still didn't tell him everything in a non-public, one-on-one, informal setting. Witkoff still has to feel something. Feel that Putin will not attack. Moreover, as is characteristic, not planning to attack all of Europe. Just a part, probably. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Finland. That's all. That is, this is already off the charts. Nowhere. We have major problems with the higher political authority in Ukraine. That is, people who seem like celestial beings descended from the heavens, and a person at 26 years old, being a member of parliament, advises an elderly woman to sell her dog in order to pay for utilities. But after that, such people are no longer around, on the air. They disappear, that is, it gets raised in the media, and these people disappear. No one hears or sees this member of parliament anymore. I asked the Americans, and after what Tucker Carlson says with Steve Witkoff, what is their reaction to all of this? To the fact that Ukrainians somehow own Russian territories. And this is all a bitter truth. And justice needs to be established by taking territories away from Ukraine. Well, historical excursions. I actually want to ask, I have a question. Is secondary education mandatory in the USA? Because I get the impression that there is some sort of segregation based on party affiliation. Democrats go to school. But what Republicans say publicly, I get the impression that they just learned to speak and immediately went to earn money from the age of 5. They learned to speak well at the age of 5 and immediately went into business. They have zero education. People generally do not understand the context, history, sociology, or anything at all. Well, why be surprised if Viktor Orban, the president of Turkey, is considered a good guy? This is a friend of Trump's, Viktor Orban, and he calls him Viktor Orban. The president of Turkey. And that's all, meaning for us, despite everything, ignorance, despite political degradation, no one allows themselves to say such things publicly as they do to the whole world. It is both ignorance and absolute immorality. In general, Trump's team consists of representatives of political riffraff. This is a new status, a new term. That is, if previously one could say they are idiots, today calling someone an idiot sounds like a compliment. Because an idiot is someone who, yes, didn't study, has no education from school, just immediately earned billions. And that's it, and that's where it all ends. And this political scum, these are people who consciously act like brutes. There's no other way to describe it. Everyone is watching this. In Kiev, there are primarily complaints. Now I am moving on to Zelensky, to the team. Well, I want to remind once again and draw this analogy with the missile strike on the Mykolaiv Regional State Administration. What Steve Witkoff, the official representative, is doing in the media. In the United States of America, this is much more significant than missile strikes. These are some incredible things. And why is our Ministry of Foreign Affairs silent? Where is the stance on all these positions? Why is there no note of protest? Remove this scum altogether. And from politics, the United States of America can express their dissatisfaction regarding Markarova. Johnson. He said she should be removed from the ambassador position. And why are we silent? Makarova is opening restaurants. She walks in sneakers in a dress and something there. Supports some LGBT community. Well, it's quite an activity, of course. But this cannot be compared to what Witkoff is saying to the whole world. That is, everything is turned upside down, black. White becomes black, black becomes white. It's simply impossible to listen to and endure all of this. Well, that's what can be said. Regarding the recent events happening in Saudi Arabia and simultaneously, all these discussions between the USA and Russia. And after this, what we should have again. Now, there's a tour ongoing, or rather, the time for talks between the USA and America and the Russian Federation. Why does one person represent them, America, in talks with Putin, and completely different people represent them in Saudi Arabia in the delegation that comes there from Russia? Well, that's how things are. I will finish here. Thank you all for your attention and for supporting the channel. All the best. Until next time.